Three seeds, that's where this story starts. Not 3 chapters, not 3 secrets. 3 seeds resting in an open palm in the kind of silence that makes you lean in closer without knowing why. A corn kernel, a bean, a squash seed. None of them look like much. None of them look like they could feed anyone through a single week, let alone an entire winter. Then the palm tilts and they fall not into a field, not into acres of turned earth stretching toward a horizon, but into a patch of ground so small you could cover it with a picnic blanket. 10 feet by 10 feet. That's the whole plot. Smaller than most driveways. Smaller than the space you'd need to park a single car. And somewhere behind a quiet farmhouse in Ohio, this exact 10 feet of dirt is about to do something that shouldn't be possible. Every single year, without exception, this small square of ground feeds a family of 8 straight through the coldest months of the year. Not with a greenhouse, not with raised beds shipped in from a catalog, not with a single bag of anything ever carried home from a store. Just 3 plants planted together in a pattern so old that nobody left in that family can name who taught it first. They only know it was handed down, hand to hand, far enough back that the trail disappears into fog. Nobody ever wrote it down. Nobody needed to. The dirt remembered for them. Here's the part that should stop you exactly where you're standing. This method was never built for a space this small. It was built for open fields, mounds spaced farther apart than most entire backyards, vines allowed to sprawl for as far as the land would let them. And somehow, impossibly, that same method has been folded down small enough to fit inside a space the size of a kiddie pool. I know how that sounds. It sounds like the kind of promise a gardening blog makes right before it tries to sell you something. But stay with me, because by the time this story ends, you're going to know exactly how a method built for acres of hillside ended up small enough to live behind your own back door. That corner of your yard you've been walking past for years, the one that seemed too small, too awkward, too much trouble to bother with, was never actually too small. You just didn't know what belonged in it. Picture a girl, 9 years old, kneeling in that same Ohio dirt 80 years earlier. Her knees are stained green from hours spent in the same spot. Beside her, her grandmother says almost nothing. She simply works slowly enough for the girl to follow every motion, the way you teach a dance through repetition instead of instruction. 3 seeds go into the ground, not scattered, not planted in the tidy rows a modern seed packet might suggest. Placed, deliberately, in a pattern this girl will repeat in this exact spot every spring for the rest of her life, without ever once needing to ask why it works. She simply knows that it does. And somewhere in that quiet certainty is the whole reason your own garden has been fighting you back, and you don't even know it yet. For most of us, gardening feels like a math problem we were never taught to solve. More space is supposed to mean more food. That's the equation we inherited. So if your space is small, you quietly assume your chances are small too. You look out at your yard and tell yourself, maybe next year, when we finally have more room. But here's what nobody ever explained to you. The people who fed entire families through brutal, unforgiving winters, using nothing but hand tools and rainfall, were not working with more space than you have right now. Many of them had less. What they carried instead was a different question entirely. Not how much space do I have, but how do I make every single inch of it work harder than it's ever worked before? And the answer to that question is older than any Amish farm. A story passed hand to hand, generation to generation, long before anyone in Pennsylvania or Ohio ever grew a single stalk of corn. Picture a hillside, centuries before any of this. Not a farm in the way we understand farms today, a hillside, tended by people who understood something about plants that most of us have completely forgotten. They noticed something strange happening whenever 3 specific crops were planted close together. Not just close, tangled, wrapped around one another like they refused to let go. They called them sisters, not for poetry, because it described with total accuracy exactly what was happening beneath the surface. The first sister stands tall. She never asks for help. She simply grows straight upward, patient and steady, reaching for the sun before anything else nearby gets the chance. The second sister cannot stand on her own. Without something to hold onto, she spends her life crawling along the ground stepped on, shaded out, forgotten before she ever gets the chance to climb. And the third sister spreads low and wide, claiming every bit of open dirt within reach, as if she's guarding something buried just beneath her leaves. On their own, each of these three plants is only ordinary. Corn, left alone, is hungry, pulling nutrients from the soil faster than almost anything else you could grow, until the ground beneath it quietly gives up after a few exhausted seasons. Beans, left alone, are fragile, sprawling, defenseless across open dirt, easy prey for anything hungry enough to reach them first. And squash, left alone, simply spreads without limit, consuming more ground every week until it's the only thing left standing. Three separate weaknesses. Three plants that would each struggle, quietly and alone, if left to fend for themselves. But someone, generations ago, noticed something that now seems obvious and somehow wasn't. Put these three together, in exactly the right pattern, and every single weakness disappears at once. The corn grows tall enough to become something the bean has never had in its life. A ladder. Instead of crawling helplessly along the dirt, the bean climbs, winding around that stalk, reaching sunlight it could never have touched on its own. And while it climbs, the bean is quietly doing something the corn desperately needs and has no way of providing for itself. Underground, in roots nobody will ever see, the bean pulls nitrogen from the air and feeds it directly into the soil, the exact nutrient the hungry corn has been draining out of the ground all season long. The bean isn't just borrowing the corn's height. It's paying that debt back in secret beneath the surface, every hour of every day. And the squash, spreading low across the ground between them, isn't merely filling empty space. Its enormous leaves block the sunlight weeds would need to survive. Its bristling stems make the entire patch uncomfortable for rabbits and deer hunting an easy meal. And as it spreads, it shades the soil itself, locking moisture into the ground instead of surrendering it to the summer heat. One plant becomes a ladder. One plant becomes a fertilizer. One plant becomes a guard standing watch. Three individual weaknesses, woven into a single system that asks almost nothing of the person tending it. That's the story passed from hand to hand for hundreds of years before it ever reached that little girl kneeling in Ohio dirt beside her grandmother. By the time it reached her family's farm, it wasn't a scientific theory anyone could explain on command. Nobody there could have defined nitrogen fixation if you'd asked them directly. It was simply the way you planted a garden, because it was the way it had always been done, because it worked without fail, and because working was reason enough. For hundreds of years, that was the entire story. Three plants, one mound, a hillside with room for as many mounds as an entire season could feed. Nobody needed to shrink it. Nobody needed to make it fit anywhere specific, because there was always more hillside waiting. Until there wasn't. Somewhere between that endless hillside and a 10-foot patch of dirt behind an Ohio farmhouse, somebody finally ran out of hillside. And that's exactly where this story picks back up. Because the traditional version of this method was built for open fields. Massive mounds, spaced 8 feet apart, corn roots spreading wide, squash vines sprawling in every direction until they'd swallowed a space the size of a small parking lot. Try to recreate that in a normal backyard, and you'd run out of room before you finished planting the second mound. For a long time, that made this method feel like something that belonged only to farms, never backyards. Something you'd read about with a kind of distant wonder, the same way you might admire a barn raising or a hand-cranked butter churn. Charming, impressive, completely out of reach for anyone without acreage to spare. But somewhere along the way, Amish families without acres of their own began asking a very different question. Not can we recreate exactly what our grandparents did, but can we shrink this down until it finally fits the ground we actually have? And it turns out, you can shrink almost everything about this method, as long as you understand exactly why each piece works in the first place. You just have to trade size for smarter placement. Picture the same three sisters, but instead of a sprawling mound stretched across an open field, imagine a single raised circle no larger than a truck tire. That's the entire footprint. At the center, instead of scattering 4 or 5 corn stalks the way an old-fashioned mound would, you plant a tight cluster, close enough together to brace one another against the wind, almost like a small bundle of poles lashed at the base. Around that cluster, right at the edge of the mound, go the beans. Not scattered loosely the way they might be across an open field, but placed with intention beside each stalk, so that within a few short weeks, every single one of them finds a corn stalk to climb. And around the outer edge of that same small circle, squash. Not the sprawling, space-devouring varieties that would swallow an entire backyard by midsummer, but the compact, bush-style varieties that stay close to their base instead of racing 20 feet in every direction. Same 3 sisters, same 3 rolls, a footprint small enough to trace with a single hula hoop. And here's the part that changes everything about how you think of small-space gardening. You're not growing 3 separate crops competing for the same patch of ground. You're not losing space by planting this way. You're multiplying it. A single 10-foot bed planted with corn, beans, and squash together produces more usable food than that same 10 feet planted with any one of those crops alone. You're no longer choosing between corn, beans, or squash. You're stacking all 3, vertically and horizontally, into a space that would normally hold only one. Which means that corner of your yard you've been walking past for years, the one that always seemed too small and too awkward to bother with, was never actually too small. It was only waiting for a system that knew how to use every inch of it, instead of wasting most of it. Let's walk through what this actually looks like, week by week, in real dirt, because watching it happen is the part that finally makes all of this click. For the first 2 weeks, this mound is keeping a secret. On the surface, almost nothing gives it away. Thin green corn blades, barely ankle-high. Small heart-shaped bean leaves pressed close to the base of each stalk. Fuzzy young squash leaves unfurling a little wider every single day. If this were all you could see, you'd swear the whole idea had been oversold. But you'd be looking in exactly the wrong place. Because underground, in the part of this story nobody ever gets to watch, something far more important is already happening. The bean roots are forming tiny nodules, small pockets where bacteria are quietly converting nitrogen from the air into a form the corn can finally use. Nobody planted those bacteria. Nobody has to feed them. They simply exist, waiting patiently for the right roots to arrive and give them a place to work. By week 4, the corn has tripled in height, standing waist-high, its stalks thickening enough to survive a stiff wind without bending. And that's the exact moment the beans stop being small heart-shaped leaves hugging the ground and start reaching upward, thin tendrils searching the open air until they find something solid to hold onto. The instant a bean vine touches a corn stalk, it wraps around it and begins to climb, sometimes gaining several inches in a single day, as if it had been waiting its entire short life for exactly this moment to arrive. Watching it happen feels less like gardening, and more like watching 2 old friends find each other again in a crowded room. Somewhere around week 5, most small gardens hit a moment that makes people want to give up entirely. A hard summer storm rolls through, the kind that flattens whatever stands in its path, and this small circle of dirt is no exception. Wind bends the corn sideways. Rain hammers the broad squash leaves flat against the ground. If you walked out to check on it the next morning, you'd brace yourself for the worst, half expecting to find the whole thing broken beyond saving. But that's not what you find. The corn stalks, planted close together in that tight cluster instead of spread thin across an open field, have been holding each other up the entire night, leaning against one another like a small group of people bracing against a crowd. A few outer leaves are torn, nothing more, and the bean vines, wrapped tightly around those same stalks, acted like rope through the darkest hours of the storm, lashing everything together instead of letting the wind carry it all away. This is the part nobody warns you about when they talk about gardening one crop at a time, each plant standing alone with nothing to lean on. A single stalk of corn, planted by itself in a windstorm, goes down easily. A cluster of stalks, tied together by living vines, barely notices the storm ever happened. By week 6, the transformation is impossible to miss, even from a distance. What began as a bare circle of dirt is now a small green tower, corn stalks disappearing into a tangle of climbing bean vines, broad squash leaves spreading across the ground below like a living blanket, covering nearly every inch of visible soil. If you didn't know better, you'd think 3 separate gardens had somehow grown into each other. You'd be half right. That's exactly what they did, on purpose. And this is usually the moment people notice something they never expected. Somewhere else in that same yard, someone is on their knees, pulling the same stubborn weeds they pulled last weekend. But inside this circle, there's nothing left to pull. Not because anyone stopped the weeds from growing, because there was never any bare dirt left for them to reach. The squash leaves closed that door weeks earlier, and nobody's touched a hoe since. By midsummer, the corn stands taller than most adults, heavy tassels swaying gently at the top. Beneath that canopy, bean pods hang in clusters along vines that have completely wrapped every available stalk. And spreading below both of them, wide squash leaves shade the soil, keeping it cool and damp even during the hottest weeks of the year, while every other garden nearby cracks and pales beneath the same relentless sun. 3 plants, 1 space, and almost nothing left for you to do except walk outside, harvest, and quietly wonder why you ever believed you needed more room than this. Here's a comparison that lands harder than any number ever could because you don't have to imagine it, you can watch it happen right in front of you. Take 2 identical 10-foot spaces. Plant one with rows of corn alone, spaced exactly the way most instructions tell you to. Plant the other with the Three Sisters Method, shrunk into a single small mound. By late summer, the corn-only bed produces a modest stack of ears, sitting on bare, tired soil already losing its color, drained by a single hungry crop that gave nothing back all season. The Three Sisters bed, in that same footprint, produces ears of corn, pounds of beans, and armloads of squash, all at once, from soil that still looks dark and rich, because it spent the entire season being fed instead of only being taken from. Same size, same sun, same rain, 2 completely different outcomes. The only difference is which plants you asked to share the space, and whether you understood what each one was truly capable of giving the others. Walk into that corn-only bed at the end of the season, and the air feels different somehow, quieter, emptier, like a room after everyone has already gone home. The stalks stand in stiff, lonely rows, and the ground between them has gone hard and pale, cracked in places from a summer spent giving without ever receiving anything back. Walk into the Three Sisters circle instead, and it feels almost crowded, almost alive with noise, corn, bean, and squash leaves brushing against each other in the breeze, the soil beneath your boots still dark and soft enough to sink your fingers into. One space merely survived the summer, the other thrived in it. There's something else that happens by the end of a season like this, something that has nothing to do with pounds of vegetables, and everything to do with how you begin to see your own yard. That little girl kneeling beside her grandmother wasn't only learning where to place 3 seeds. She was learning that a small space isn't actually small once you know how to use it. She grew up, and she taught her own children that exact same pattern, in that exact same spot, and some of those children are still planting it today, in that same 10-foot circle behind that same farmhouse, feeding families of their own, without ever needing to buy a single bag of anything from a store. That's not coincidence. That's not luck. That's what happens when a piece of knowledge becomes small enough, simple enough, and useful enough to survive being handed down by memory alone, generation after generation, without ever needing to be written in a single book. You don't need a farm to be part of that same story. You don't need acreage, or a tractor, or land that's belonged to your family for 100 years. You need a circle of dirt no bigger than a hula hoop, 3 kinds of seeds, and patience while the roots quietly do the part of the work you'll never actually see happening. So if you've been standing at the edge of your own backyard, looking at some small, awkward corner and telling yourself it's not big enough to matter, picture that little girl again, kneeling in 10 feet of Ohio dirt, feeding a family of 8 straight through winter, without a single acre to her name. She didn't need more space. She needed 3 sisters who knew how to take care of each other. And now so do you. Because somewhere behind your own house, right now, there's a patch of ground exactly like that one. Small, overlooked, waiting for the same 3 seeds that fed families for generations before anyone ever thought to write the instructions down. The only question left is whether you're going to keep walking past it, or whether you're finally going to kneel down and plant something that already knows how to take care of itself. And once you do, once that first bean vine finds its way around that first corn stalk, you'll understand something this channel keeps circling back to, week after week. That the smallest patch of ground you own is still holding more forgotten wisdom than you've ever given it credit for. There's another secret buried in that same 10 feet of dirt, one that has nothing to do with what you plant in it, and everything to do with what you'll never have to buy again. That's next.